the book of Galatians. Yes. I did. Yes, sir. Okay, what's that? That's actually what we spent the entire class on last time. So I'm going to give you the short version of it, and then I'll say consult YouTube or the Facebook page and watch the video. It is available. So I'm not going to dismiss that question, but the short version is, notice first off that it says, when this letter is read among you, have it also read in the church that is the Laodiceans, and you, for your part, read my letter that is from Laodicea. It doesn't say that this was a letter that was written to Laodicea. It was a letter that the church at Laodicea currently had possession of. And so what we see actually from this verse is that these early epistles were actually intended to be circulated among the churches. And that's how we ended up studying Galatians. Galatians is one of those letters. It is one that I've never come across a scholar who argues that this is the letter. Most people say it's probably the Ephesian letter. I think it's possible that it was this letter, which is why we're studying it now. And I think it's possible because it was an earlier letter. There are some historians from the time period that view Laodicea as part of Galatia. And this letter was written to the churches of Galatia. And so it's debatable whether or not it was part of Galatia. We're going to talk about that a little bit tonight in the introduction to try to understand who these churches were. But anyway, that's the short version of it. These epistles are circular epistles. They were always intended to be read and distributed among believers in all places.
That's all fine. One thought that I was having that curious about in Revelation, the church there, lukewarm. They can either hot or cold, but anyway, you feel on his mouth. But
right.
To me, lukewarm is just as bad as being cold.
It actually says it's worse. Right.
So that, to me, was kind of a question mark.
Okay. And I'll touch on that as well. First off, I do want to talk about, since how you brought it up, why the text in Revelation suggests that being lukewarm is worse than being cold or hot. If you're cold, if you're completely cold, there's not much doubt that what you're doing is wrong. It's easy enough to show people and make them aware of what they're not doing that they ought to be doing, or that they are doing that they ought not to be doing, if they are in fact that far removed from God. It's the people who don't do, quote unquote, anything wrong, but also who don't do anything right, as you expressed it, who are likely to look at themselves and say, we're not so bad, when they're not pleasing God. And that's a very dangerous place to be, to not see that you're displeasing.
In their particular instance, they were more enamored with their wealth at that time. Not so much serving God.
That's not a problem for Americans, is it?
Not too much. And so the lesson I think we need to look at there is not necessarily what they were concerned with and wealth and all that, but the way they were serving the Lord. And so we need to, I think, put ourselves in the position of being lukewarm or cold.
Right.
Are
I think that's a legitimate question. Yeah, I think that's a legitimate question. It's worth asking. I'll also say that I think that's the point of it being recorded in the opening of Revelation. I think those 7 churches are intended to represent any congregation and the kind of things that beset us, to use a biblical term. So that's certainly the idea. That's also why all of these epistles are just as valid and important for us to read today as they were when they were written, and just as valid for us as they were to the people in the location that they're addressed. Raise your hand if you live in Galatia. Raise your hand if you even know where Galatia is. Hopefully by the end of the night you're going to know a little bit more about where Galatia is. But why do I care about a letter written to the churches of Galatia? And so keep that in mind. We're going to touch on that in a minute. Now, I also want to go ahead and inject this, since how you brought up Revelation. The Revelation letter was written later, quite a bit later probably than the Galatian letter. Less of a time period later, but still later than Colossians. But what that also shows us, by virtue of the fact that at least Paul didn't feel any need to render them any caution about the problems of Galatia when he talked about them and expected that they were going to have association with them to some extent or another, is that at the time that Colossians was written, that's not a complete description of the condition of the church at Laodicea. And so it got that in that condition. It didn't start there. And though it didn't happen overnight, it would seem that it happened fairly quickly. In the matter of years, not decades. Because from the writing of this letter to when the Revelation letter was written, we're talking about 30, 40 years on the outside. From Colossians to when that letter was written, we're talking about 10 or 20 years. Or less, possibly. And so we can get ourselves diverted away from God. We can lose our first love. We can get involved in false doctrine in a relatively short period of time if we're not careful. And so there are important lessons about all those things. Now, I don't want to get into my next question that's going to pop up too much. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about the region of Galatia a little bit. And then we're actually going to get into a few things that I think will touch back on some of this discussion, and it'll be worthwhile. Galatia is actually able, we did talk about this a little bit last week, is actually able to be viewed in different ways. We talked about the fact that those borders were pretty fluid, that they moved from time to time. We talked about how different scholars or historians from the time period placed, for instance, the city of Laodicea in a different province, and why that was, or why there would be discrepancy about those things. This is one of the reasons. And this is the map we looked at last time. And we saw, I just lost my, there we go. We saw that Galatia is represented right here in the middle. Let's use green. In this region right here. This little lump of cities is down in the south part of Galatia. And so we're looking at Pisidian and Antioch and Iconium and Lystra and all these cities down here. And Galatia is this central region, kind of in the northern sector off the coast of what we call Asia Minor. This is the island of Cyprus. If you keep on going around here, Jerusalem's down here a little bit further. Rome is this way. This is the geographical breakdown of the province of Galatia. There is another way to understand Galatia. We looked at this map last time. And this is a map that reflects the political understanding of Galatia. The political understanding of Galatia is created by the Roman government. And it included not just this central region like the other one, but all of this was considered Galatia. It is not clear from this letter whether we are talking about Galatia in the political comprehension or we're talking about Galatia in the geographical comprehension. It doesn't make that distinction. Basically, Rome took over this part of the world and created the province of Galatia as they described it, the political province of Galatia, in 25 BC. This letter is written somewhere between 40 and 50 AD. So we're talking about 65 years earlier that Rome would have created these political boundaries and started calling it Galatia. Rome controlled the world at the time. It is extremely possible that when this letter opens up and says, to all the brethren, to the churches of Galatia, that what he has in mind is the Roman province of Galatia, which is a much bigger area and includes a lot of other places. It is in that sense that I think that Ptolemy talked about the city we were just discussing. What is that? The one we were just discussing from Colossians. Laodicea, thank you. I kept thinking Lystra because it was on the map, and I'm like, that's not right. Laodicea, Ptolemy says, was in Galatia. The reason he would have placed it in Galatia is because it probably was seen as in Galatia under this political boundary. It's possible that this letter, therefore, that was written to the churches of Galatia is the letter that Laodicea had. That the church at Colossae was told, all right, it's your turn to take it from them. You bring this letter to them and get the letter that they have from Laodicea and bring it back and y'all study it. Doesn't really matter a whole lot. I think we would be told specifically if that mattered greatly, but it is something to consider. And it is, I think, worth some consideration. So we need to keep in mind that there are both of these geographical and these political breakdowns of this region. And so we don't know how many congregations were expected to receive this letter. But what it does make very, very clear is that this letter was not intended to be kept or held by one congregation. It was intended from the outset to be delivered and circulated among all of the churches, at least in the region of Galatia, which may have been, who knows, 5, 10, 15 different groups, 20? We don't know exactly, because it doesn't name them specifically. But it was not an isolated, this is what's happening with this one church. We're going to address these issues in this one place kind of thing. It is, I think in that sense, to be viewed as a more general type epistle that is dealing with common problems in all the churches, at least in all the churches of Galatia. Time frame, it's believed to be one of Paul's earlier epistles, maybe written as early as at the end of the first missionary journey. It's addressing specifically some of the problems that arose from Judaizing teaching. Since how Paul doesn't appeal to the letter, which was distributed from the apostles out of Jerusalem in Acts 15, answering that question authoritatively. You'll recall that in Acts 15, that's what the subject matter is. There were some Judaizing teachers that were out and about teaching the Gentile Christians that they had to do certain things from Judaism in order to be faithful Christians. That was brought back to Jerusalem where they were from. The apostles were involved. They got together. They discussed the matter. They came to an agreement about what the Scripture demanded. And they wrote a letter and said, you take this back and tell them that they don't need to worry about that stuff. Paul doesn't appeal to that situation as a basis on which to draw the conclusions he draws in this letter. He deals with the Judaizing teachers from a doctrinal standpoint, but not from a, we've already decided this and this is what we decided kind of standpoint. In fact, he doesn't mention at all much the decision or the discussion in Acts 15. So it was possibly as early as the 40s when this was written, but no later than the 50s. As I mentioned a lot of times when we talk about this kind of stuff, if it was essential that we know exactly when it was written, what would we have in the text?
There would be some indication of when it was written.
There would be an indication of when it's written. There's indications all throughout the Bible of when things are written. In the 3rd year of the reign of this king, the word of the Lord came to this prophet. You can identify the exact year that that's written relatively easily by identifying the years that king reigned, which the 3rd year would have been. That's the year it was written. This has no date marker at all. And so I would suggest to you that it is irrelevant to the subject matter to know exactly when this was written. What's the purpose of the epistles? Why are there epistles at all?
Teaching and exhortation.
Okay. Teaching and exhortation. If I change the question and say, what's the purpose of the Gospels? What's our answer?
How much it is to go to heaven if we obey the gospel.
The gospel or the gospels?
The Gospels as a block. Why were they written? Why do we have the Gospels written? So we might know who Jesus was. So that we might know that he is the Christ, the Son of the living God. We might have life in his name. Isn't that what John says at the end of his Gospels? These things are written that you might believe, and that believing you might have life in his name. So to identify who Jesus was, to identify what Jesus has done, to identify that life is found in him, that's the purpose of the Gospels. What's the purpose of the book of Acts? Please don't get this one wrong. We studied it not that long ago.
Show us how to obey the gospel and go to heaven.
Okay. At least 3 of the Gospels make allusion to what we call the Great Commission, go into all the world and preach the gospel of the whole creation. Luke specifically ends his Gospel and then opens the book of Acts saying what? I'm writing this to give you a chronological or consecutive order account, which we're done. In other words, the book of Acts is a catalog of how the gospel went into all the world, beginning at Jerusalem, Acts chapter 2, then throughout Judea, and then Samaria, and then to the uttermost parts of the world. By the time you get to the end of Acts, where's the gospel?
As far as Rome.
All the way being preached in Rome. And he's taken what we call his missionary journeys throughout Asia Minor, throughout parts of Europe, We've seen the gospel message carried far beyond Jerusalem and Judea. And we see the fulfillment of the Great Commission. That, in fact, the gospel had gone forth into the world as Christ had ordered the apostles to do. That's why it's called the Act of the Apostles. The apostles were commissioned with a job. These are the acts that the apostles engaged in order to do what? To accomplish that job. Now, there's a lot of learning that we can do in the process of that. About other things even. But the main purpose of the book of Acts, you could say, is to give us a record of the Great Commission being fulfilled and the gospel going to the world. So then we get to the epistles. What are they for? Is it fair to say that the epistles address problems that existed in the churches? Now, I believe, and I bring this up as often as I possibly can, so I'm going to bring it up here, that there is nothing new under the sun. Problems that approached and plagued the first century church are the same kinds of problems that approach and plague churches today. There are some things that are different. There are some technologies that have changed. As far as I know, the apostles didn't have the internet and they didn't stream their sermons. Although maybe they did and we just lost it. I don't know. But when you get down to the core of faith and the core of what humanity is and the problems that humans face and the things that divert us from God and get in the way of our belief and our obedience, the exact same problems are being set before us, just maybe in a slightly different way. He wrote to the church at Corinth to be mindful that evil communications could corrupt good morals. He didn't have television in mind. He didn't have radio in mind. He didn't have the internet in mind. But the same problem, evil communication, corrupt interaction with people, is what he's talking about there, that is realized through those particular vessels, media platforms, whatever you want to call them. It's the same problem. It's just a new and more efficient way to create the problem. That's what we're really good at, making things more efficient, right? Make it easier to sin. But by the way, that's not anything new either, because you can go all the way back to Genesis chapter 6 and find out that only evil was continually on the mind of man at that time, and he was always inventing new ways to sin. So that's been going on since the very beginning as well. The enticement to sin itself, when did that start? In the Garden of Eden itself. See, there's not really anything new when you talk about all this stuff. It's the same kind of problem. So when we read these epistles and he deals with the problems that arose in those churches, these are the same kinds of things that we're going to have to deal with and address ourselves. They often address misunderstandings. Misunderstandings that the people had about teaching, right? Peter talks about that in one of his epistles, about how some of Paul's writings are hard to understand. Luke talks about that in his writing, that he wrote these things so that we could be certain about the gospel that we believed. The epistles were written to address some of the common misunderstandings of the day. Do you think those misunderstandings are different than our misunderstandings? You can only conclude that they are if you believe that there's something new under the sun. And so those misunderstandings about what applies and how it applies are the same kinds of things that we struggle with, and they address those things. The epistles apply doctrine in very practical ways. One of the epistles written to a congregation that existed in a community that was in the midst of idolatry, and the markets were full of meat that was sacrificed to idols, rehearses the question of whether or not it was proper for Christians to eat meat that had been used in a sacrifice to an idol. Now, what's clear is that God doesn't want us to have anything to do with the worship of idols, right? So does that mean we have to completely abstain from meat that came from that source originally? Does it mean that I'm participating in the idol if I simply eat a steak that had been taken from an animal that was used in a sacrifice at an idol? That's one of the questions that had to be dealt with.
Only if people get the wrong idea that you're doing it for a purpose.
That's part of the answer. But that's a very practical way of applying the doctrine of not being entangled in those things. What does it mean to not be entangled in those things? He says, well, in this case, eat without asking any questions. Don't go in and sit down at the table and say, hey, is this from an idol? Because then if they say yes, does that mean you have to say, well, I can't have anything? And the answer is maybe it does. And so I have to ask those questions and so he goes through that process. And so we learn from reading those things how to actually make practical application of these doctrinal principles. And so it's important that we be exposed to that and understand that. They're also written to encourage the brethren, aren't they? One of my favorite encouragements in all of the Scripture is when he writes to a group and he says, you're doing all of these things great, excel still more. Which is suggesting to us what? To get back to something that came up in the question that John asked in the beginning of class that goes back to the study of Colossians. We have that church in Laodicea that's described in the book of Revelation as being lukewarm. Were they excelling still more? Did they get to a point that they were doing what was right and then push that further and excel in those things even more than they had been? Or did they get comfortable with their situation and think, oh, we got this all worked out and we can just be relaxed now? I'm highly suspicious that if you went to church there, in that lukewarm church, you didn't look around and say, well, this is an unfaithful church. You know when they probably met? On the first day of the week. You know what they probably did? Sang songs and prayed. Opened the Word of God and read it. Partook of the supper. We likely would have sat among them and thought, what? But these are good sound brethren. But where was their heart? They didn't excel still more. They weren't pushing forward and growing in their love and devotion to God. They were satisfied with what they had already done. And so when he encourages another group, hey, it's great that you're doing all this stuff, but excel still more. Push forward. Continue to grow and develop. Find ways to serve that you're not currently engaged in. Don't look for the opportunity to sit down. In fact, how many times throughout the epistles do we hear the warning not to grow weary in well-doing? And so we have these encouragements and exhortations that are designed to keep us active and keep us moving and keep us growing. We could add to that list the word warnings. In a lot of these letters, there are warnings about potential pitfalls. Therefore, let he who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. Let not many of you become teachers, because you will incur a stricter judgment. Lots of warnings about various things that can create problems for us, so we're more careful. When James says, let not many of you become teachers, is he saying is he saying that God doesn't want us to teach? If you believe that, I suggest you go back and read Hebrews chapter 5. Because what happens to the Hebrew Christians in Hebrews chapter 5? They're told by now you ought to be teachers. But instead you need to be taught. It's not that he doesn't want us to become teachers, it's that he wants us to be cautious when we teach. To be careful as we move into that sphere. And to make sure that what we're saying is right. So that we don't lead people astray. And so all of these things happen in the epistles, and so it's important that we study these epistles because look, teaching us the same things. The same pitfalls exist for the church right here in Lafayette that existed for all these churches. We have, generally speaking, comfortable lives. We have our physical health. We live in homes. We have the food that we need. Is it possible that we get to the point that we think that, hey, we have no need of anything? While at the same time, as Jesus tells them, you're actually wretched and miserable, poor and blind. And what's the problem there? Well, because they were looking at what their physical circumstances were and not looking at what their spiritual circumstances were. Is that a problem for us? Is it possible that we can get choked out by the worries and the riches and the pleasures of this life and not bear fruit? Is it possible that we get entangled in false doctrine? Is it possible that we fall into the trap of, and one of the things he's going to deal with in this very book, is falling into the trap of acting by tradition. Just because we're doing the right thing, if the only reason we're doing it is because it's traditional, does that mean we're serving God? Think about that. And so it's the same kind of problems. They may present themselves in a slightly different way, but it's the exact same issue. By the way, what's the source behind all of these problems? Satan, our enemy. But then he talks about later in this very letter that we're going to study, the great damage that we can do ourselves by fighting and dividing and devouring one another. Becoming our own worst enemy. Making it even worse by amplifying the problems that are already there. Can that be a problem today? There's discussions in these epistles about leadership and those roles being abused, whether it be in the home or whether it be in the local church. We don't have that problem today, do we? There's discussions about lack of love. We don't have that problem. We abound in love, and we do nothing but act in love toward one another, right? I'm not really trying to be, well, I am. I'm being facetious. I'm being sarcastic. Because if we truly were acting in love toward one another all the time, what would be the case? We would never sin against one another. But we do. So obviously we're not always acting out of the motivation of love for one another. We're not always acting out of the motivation of love for God. If we were always acting out of the motivation of love for God, then what would we do? We would always keep His commandments. How do we know that? Because both in the Gospel of John and in the epistles of John, we are told that Jesus taught, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. If we were always acting out of that motivation, then we would always be doing what was right. We're not always doing what was right, so we lack love at times. These epistles remind us of that fact so that we might be careful and watch how we act toward one another. And realize that how I speak and act toward you affects my relationship with God. And how I speak and act in my home affects my relationship with God. And how I speak and act in this community toward unbelievers affects my relationship with God. It's these epistles that teach us these things. Else we would act probably just exactly like the Pharisees, who didn't care about anybody but themselves, who lacked compassion and love, but thought that they were the most righteous people walking down the street. And Jesus told them repeatedly what? You do err not knowing the Scriptures. Go and learn what this means. Have you not read this? Why did they think that way? Well, because they were beset with the very problems that the early churches were beset by and that we are beset by as well. And so these studies are extremely important. And do you know what the very first thing that Paul does in this is? We're going to talk about this as we get into the text next time. But the very first thing that he does is he says, an apostle not sent from men. Which is his way of saying what? This letter comes from God, not from men. Don't think that this is my thoughts about how you ought to behave. This is what God wants you to know. I'm a messenger from God. Through the agency of man. Agency of men wasn't involved in this. He said God was involved in this. I was through Jesus Christ that I came. Through Jesus Christ and God the Father. That's how I was made what I am. That's why I've been sent. That's who has charged me to write these things. So it's important for us to understand that we have to receive this as the Word of God.
To him at that point, Mike, he's laying the foundation for them that he sure is the Father.
Yeah, and they probably knew that. Some of these churches that would have received this letter that were part of the churches of Galatia are actually churches that came into existence how? Through his preaching. Not all of them, but some of them. They had probably all heard of Paul. We're going to read actually in this letter that after he became an apostle, it was 15 years before he went back to Jerusalem, but when he went back, they had already heard of the things that he had done, and they had already learned that Paul, who once persecuted the church, was now preaching the gospel. They already knew that. How did they know that? Because people talked about these things. He was known in the world, but he is underscoring and highlighting the fact that this isn't just my opinions. I've been appointed by God to do this work. And so you need to receive this letter not as if it came from a man, but as if it came from God. And are we to receive it any different? And so we need to keep all of that in mind as we move through this. Any questions or comments about these things or anything you want to raise at the end of tonight? I don't have time to get into the text itself, so I'm not going to do that. All right. So next time you can be prepared by reading chapter 1. I don't know if we'll get all the way through chapter 1 or not next week, but we're going to give it the old college try and see what happens. For those that are watching online, there are people in the room that are shaking their head no. It ain't going to happen. No, we're going to try. Somebody said the first paragraph. Listen, we can make it the first sentence if you want. There's probably enough there. But I don't plan on doing that. We will try to keep the pace up to keep it interesting. I would at least read the first chapter before next week. I would encourage you to read the entire book a couple of times before next week. All right. Thanks for your presence and participation.